Work on this. Okay, welcome everybody to our very last IRG2 meeting of the quarter. We are really excited to have saved the very best presentation to the very last slot. This is Adele Myers from Nina Miolane's group. Adele will be giving a presentation on learning from landmarks, curves, surfaces, and shapes in Geomstats. Take it away, Adele.
Wow. Thank you for the honor of being the last presentation, saving the best for last. As you said, we'll be talking about learning from landmarks, curves, surfaces, and shapes in Geomstats. This is a talk that's based on a paper that I'm currently a co-author on with Nina and other people in our lab. I think that this talk will be very, very interesting to anyone who's interested in anything in nature, because shapes are everywhere in nature, specifically in the materials department. I know there are people working on cell properties, and in the psych department, there are people working on brain properties, and in the materials department, there are people working on crystals and how things deform when under pressure. So shapes are really a fundamental element of nature, and I think that this will be applicable to a lot of you, or I hope it will be applicable to a lot of you. So therefore, quantifying differences between shapes is relevant for nearly every field. So here's the crux of the presentation. What exactly is a shape? And we'll spend the rest of the presentation developing this idea, developing mathematics to help us define this. So a shape is something that's invariant to translation, rotation, scaling, and reparametrization. Translation may be just that the shape is, or the image is shifted a little bit. Rotation, maybe the camera was rotated a little bit. Scaling, the camera was closer or further away. And reparametrization is a measure of how we choose to, let's wait for it, how we choose to sample the outside of the shape. So ideally, a shape is something that no matter how you change any of these things, the shape is still measured as being the same. How to mathematically describe and compare shapes. This is an active field of research. And in Geomstats, we use the mathematical framework of landmarks, curves, and surfaces to develop what we mean by what is a shape. So these three things by themselves are not inherently shapes, but we will define mathematical frameworks for each to enable definitions of shapes in each case. So first, we'll do landmarks because those are the simplest. Then we'll go on to manifolds and metrics because those are pretty important in understanding shapes and shape spaces. Curves and surfaces. And then finally, after we've developed all of the theory, we'll move on to how to use geomstats to perform statistics on shape spaces. And I think that for a lot of people, this fifth bullet point will be the most useful. So what is a shape in terms of landmarks? Landmarks are points which someone, in this case me, deems as important points on an object, in this case, a dog. Examples are the top of a head, or the tip of an ear, or the tip of a nose. So a landmark set is a set of individual landmarks which are placed on important objects on an entity. The purpose is generally to measure an individual dog anatomy or human anatomy or the anatomy or of whatever you're studying. Question, you don't have to answer this, I'll just pose it. Why are landmark sets not inherently shapes? And I'll let people think about that for 3 seconds before I answer.
Points, not areas?
Hmm?
Is it because they're points and not areas?
Not quite. So thinking back to the other slide, if the dog moves to the right, tilts its head, or moves closer, like gets scaled up, the landmarks would have different coordinates, even though it's the same dog. So ideally, the same dog would be measured in the same way or quantified in the same way, no matter if it moves or rotates or gets closer, it's still the same dog. So we still want a landmark set shape to be measured the same way, no matter if any of these things happen. So the goal is to define what we mean by landmark shapes that are invariant to translation, scaling, and rotation. And here I'll give you a little graphic of how we are able to put a landmark set into a landmark shape. So first we center the landmark set, then we scale the landmark set so that the sum of the squared distances from the origin are equal to 1. And then we quotient by rotation, which essentially just means that we do a mathematical thing to make sure that no matter how these landmarks are rotated, they're all measured as the same thing, the same shape. One note, how do we move that?
I don't think you do.
I don't know if we can.
Yes, you can.
You can.
It depends whose computer.
That's a computer on the CNSI.
Oh, well, that's, okay, I'm too, yeah, I'm
That's,
too
that's,
optimistic.
that's the reason I say I don't know.
Yeah, you're smarter than me, as always.
I can also just read it off my screen, but I'm trying to, I think I have things in that upper right-hand corner in the.
It's soothing to see Mengyang.
Okay, yes.
I don't know. I'm so
It's
sorry.
okay, no, it's okay, it's okay. If there's anything that's in that corner, I'll just tell you
What's
what it
the
is.
computer for the Zoom? It's not your computer?
It's, I think I'm the host.
Can you move? Oh, yeah.
He's not on mine, but,
No,
I think you're in charge. Keep
It's a-
going.
Okay, thank you. So, what that says.
Oh,
Oh,
you can use the
nice.
mouse, that's right.
There we go.
But how?
Oh gosh.
No, we're stuck.
Look at all this stuff he's doing though.
Maybe in more if you
Go to view, have it, go to view maybe. There's
Where do you
when
see
you are-
that?
Debugging by
In the
committee is
bottom?
my favorite thing.
When you
yeah,
are putting
yeah.
cursor
Yeah.
on the screen of.
We'll edit all this out.
person.
Well, earlier there was like a little bar on the
Yeah.
bottom.
then
However, it was the
bar,
Yeah, do that
you
again.
have view.
Yes.
Ah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good,
There.
maybe try view.
View. You know what? I,
Where did you see?
View.
in the middle.
Left, left.
Yes, right there.
I only did speaker and I said, I
No.
said hide everything else.
Yeah.
I think that worked.
Wow, nice. Thank you
Now
so
we have to
much.
figure out-
Good job.
Oh, I
Good
was
job.
right.
Go team.
I'm so happy to be giving
Been
a
in this
talk
room too many times.
with the smart people of the materials department.
He's from chemistry,
Chemistry.
actually.
From
Material
chemistry.
science. That's the
No, I
problem.
tried and I failed.
So now we can see clearly that landmark sets don't have to be invariant to reparameterization, which is the thing I talked about earlier, where you have a choice of where you put the sampling points around the curve. And the reason they don't have to be invariant to reparameterization is because each point is directly associated with a biological entity. So you don't really have a choice of where you put it, because each point automatically corresponds to something that's physically real and something you already know you want to measure. So, another important point, how do we compare landmark sets? So let's say we have this dog and that dog. They clearly have very, very different anatomies, and we want to be able to quantify the difference between their anatomies. How do we do this? This is where our friend manifolds come into play. This is the shape, the Kendall space shape, where every single point in this mathematical space represents a different landmark set shape. So this dog shape corresponds to this point, and this dog shape corresponds to this point. And then, now that we have points in a space instead of landmark set shapes, all we have to do is measure the distance between these points. So the distance between the 2 points quantifies the difference between the landmark sets. But this actually is not simple, because remember that this is curved space. So how can we compute distances on manifolds?
Sorry, can I just ask, I mean, why is it a curved space per se? I mean, I guess in this
Yeah.
case, you have just 2 degrees of freedom, right? You place the red dot and then you have the distances to the other 2, maybe more because there's some angles, I guess, but
Yeah.
what sets the geometry of the manifold, maybe?
So this is a really good question. So
Maybe 4 degrees of freedom, yeah, wait, go ahead.
first, I'll say that this is not actually a 2D sphere. It's like higher dimensional.
Sure.
But let me give you some intuition about why it's a high dimensional sphere. Each of these, this is specifically the manifold for 2D landmark sets with 3 points. And the reason that it's a sphere is because of the scaling thing I talked about. So this thing, where we force all of these to be equal to 1, this kind of looks like the equation for a sphere, except each of these distances is actually like, you know, x1, whatever. So that's why it's a higher dimensional sphere, but this constraint where we force these squared quantities to be equal to 1 is what constrains all of these points to be on the surface of a sphere. That was a really good question.
Thank you.
And then we're kind of ignoring that this all makes it an even more complicated sphere. So, how do we compute distances on manifolds? This is an extremely important question in studying shapes, because it's very common for shape spaces to be curved because of all of these restraints that we put on the points. Like they have to be translation, rotation, scaling, invariant. Like all of these invariances force the points to lie on manifolds. Thus, to understand shape spaces, it's important to understand manifolds and operations on manifolds before we can do any statistics on manifolds. So first, what is a manifold? There are several ways to define a manifold. If you don't follow any of this, it's okay. I'll give you a vague description at the end. So there are several ways to define a manifold. Some examples are the set of points. Points is like a mathematical space that verify a constraint defined by an implicit equation given by the function f. So for example, we just talked about the surface of a sphere. All of the points on the surface of the sphere have to verify the constraint that their distance from the origin is equal to 1 or a or something like that. Another definition is a space that locally resembles Euclidean space near each point. If you don't understand any of that, just think about a manifold as a set of points that all satisfy the same constraint. And if the manifold is easily embedded in Euclidean space, then it might look like a surface, like the surface of a sphere. Second, what is a Riemannian manifold and a Riemannian metric? This, I'm going to read it, but if you don't understand it, this is the key. So a Riemannian metric G on a smooth manifold is a family of inner products defined on each tangent space that varies smoothly with P. A pair, so a manifold metric pair, is called a Riemannian manifold. And if you don't understand this, all you need to know is that Riemannian metrics are important because they provide a notion of distance on manifolds and allow the computation of all manifold operations. So if we want to compute distance on manifold, which was our original motivator for all of this, we need Riemannian metrics. Okay, elementary manifold operations. First, I'll kind of go over what they are in Euclidean space, which is just normal, like XYZ or XY, essentially a space where the shortest distance between 2 points is a line and not some other curvy thing. So in Euclidean space, the elements are points and vectors. And the operations are addition, where you take a point, you add a vector, and you get another point. Subtraction, where you take a point, subtract a point, and get a vector. And linear distance, which is the length of a line between 2 points. On manifolds, it's not that different, but we have to introduce a few new concepts. So on a manifold, the elements are still points, but now we have tangent vectors instead of vectors. A tangent vector is essentially just at each point, there's a set of tangent vectors, and all of those tangent vectors are tangent to the manifold at that point. So the tangent vectors of this point are different than the tangent vectors of that point. The operations are kind of similar, like I said, but a little different. So the exponential, we take a point and a tangent vector, and we get a point. So we take a point and a tangent vector, and it kind of shoots along this manifold to get a new point. The logarithm takes 2 points and gives us a vector. So we have 2 points, and then it gives us this vector. 2 points gives us this vector. And the geodesic distance, which is the length of the geodesic between 2 points. Question?
So for this like exponential operation, this like vector object has like, can I think of it as like the direction is like where I start from, like when I'm going to my new point, and then the direction, and then the magnitude is like how far I keep crawling along the surface.
I think that's a really good way to think about the vector in the exponential. Yeah. This vector can be any point in the tangent space at this point, but we chose this, because we chose this vector, it shoots in this direction along for kind of the length, which is exactly what you said. Yeah, that was a good question. I think you get it. Any other questions? Okay, how to compute, okay, yeah, go
Can I
ahead.
ask a quick follow-up?
Definitely.
So, based on what Austin said, is it that because the distance from the center of our circle example to the blue is what it is, the distance from our center to the orange point will be the same?
So in this, are you saying that because this is, yes,
Like
I think I
one
understand what you're
point.
saying. Yeah, exactly. So we have this point on this manifold, and all of the points on this manifold have, let's say that this distance is 1. So all of the points on this manifold have distance 1 from the origin, and because we're choosing, this point on this manifold, that means that every single point that we have a tangent vector that shoots from this point, every single possible exponential result will have this distance 1 from the origin. I think you get it too. Good. Yeah. Okay, so now we're on to kind of back to our original question of how to compute distances. First, again, we're going to start in Euclidean space just to set up the framework. So first, know the data is manifold, so know what restraints are acting on your data. In this case, there are no restraints, so we're just in Euclidean space. Everything is easy. Then we choose a metric to equip the manifold with. This is the thing that I was talking about earlier that will let us define distances. In Euclidean space, it's really easy. It's just the identity matrix. Then we choose 2 points to measure the distance between, in this case, A and B. And then we use the inner product to measure distance between 2 points. So in this case, distance is equal to the squared norm of A minus B, which we're gonna call C, which is equal to the inner product of C with C, which is equal to this thing. If you don't understand Einstein's notation, just know that this is the key element that is where our metric is influencing distance on the manifold. And because our metric is nice, it just gives us this very familiar notion of distance. And this is another way that people describe the metric. If you don't know what this is, just ignore it, but I only put it there for people who that would be useful to them. Okay, now we're gonna learn how to compute distances on curved spaces, manifolds. Same thing, know the data's manifold, aka know what constraints are acting on it. Choose a metric to equip the manifold with. In the case of the sphere, this is the metric. Choose 2 points to compute the distance between, and use the inner product to measure distance. The key things to note here are that now, instead of C being A minus B, it's now log of A minus B, because we're on a manifold now. And now this same metric term will yield something very different because of our R squared term, which is in the metric there, and our R squared sine squared theta term, which is there. So we can see that the metric is clearly influencing distance on manifolds, and choice of metric also influences distance, and we're not able to compute distances on manifolds without the metric.
What is the angle theta and phi? Like,
Oh, so theta and phi, are you familiar with spherical coordinates?
yes.
So theta and phi are like spherical
In this
coordinates.
sphere, I just want to,
Yeah.
visualize that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so they're like spherical coordinates. We don't put R, well, we do, yeah. Wait, are you asking like, is theta the one that
What
goes
respect- I just
around?
want to imagine the angle, like theta, is it the angle between A and B, and phi is what, between what? Like, I
Oh,
cannot
yeah.
imagine
So
the angle.
theta and phi are literally just like
Like,
the
what really-
intrinsic coordinates.
0 to 2
So
pi, 0 to 2 pi.
exactly, so
Just normal?
yeah, so if B has, so theta and phi are yeah, exactly, just normal.
Okay.
So this whole sphere is parameterized by theta and phi, and therefore each point has an individual theta and phi. Theta and phi in this case are called intrinsic coordinates because they're the
Okay.
coordinates of the manifold. So A has a theta and phi and B has a theta and phi. Does that
Okay,
make sense?
yeah.
Okay.
I just want to understand the difference because sine theta, it can vary from -1 to 1, I guess. And then it goes from 0 to 360, and phi can also go from 0 to 360.
Yeah, so in this case, I think theta would be from 0 to pi and phi would be from 0 to 2 pi.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so why use manifold operations? I think based on the really great questions you're all asking, I think you get it, but we'll just do this anyway. So recall our original question of how to, compute statistics on this manifold where each point is a different landmark set. What if we want to compute the mean landmark set between two dogs? So like computing the mean dog between these two dogs. The wrong way to do this would be to just compute the linear mean, because the result would not be a landmark set shape because it doesn't follow the manifold. So we have to use manifold operations to compute the Frechet mean, which is essentially the manifold mean. So it'll give you the mean point that actually lies on the manifold. Okay. So we've covered manifold operations, we've covered landmarks, we've covered how to make landmark sets into shapes, why they fall on manifolds also. So that's one way to mathematically define a shape, is with landmarks. But curves and surfaces kind of span some separate questions. For example, what if you just really want to know like the full shape of this cell? What if you want to quantify this entire border and not just, you know, nose, head, ear? Then you would use a curve. Or if you have a kind of the same thing, but in 3D, then you would use a surface. So curves and surfaces are a little bit different, but you'll see that they have some of the same concepts as landmarks. Okay, theoretical framework for curves. So this is for continuous curves. In the case of continuous curves, each map C represents a different smooth curve. C maps points from this domain, aka points on the line between 0 and 1. C maps points from here over to R2. And C has a function definition. If you change this definition, then this shape will change. So you should be, well, maybe I shouldn't assume this, but this is a fairly common change of coordinates. So if you take points along U and you say R cosine U, R sine U, then it'll kind of give us like a circular looking thing. If we change this to something more complicated, then it might be more complicated over here. So each map represents a different curve. In practice, when we measure a curve in nature to learn something about it, we're forced to discretize it, aka take sampling points. So if our original curve looks something like this, we're forced to take sampling points to approximate the curve. Just like with landmarks, we're measuring points along the curve, but in contrast to landmarks, the points we choose have no physical meaning. They're arbitrary. So for example, we could choose to measure the points like that, but for the same shape, we could also choose to measure the points like this. Because points can be chosen in any manner, curve shapes must be reparametrization invariant, in addition to translation, scale, and rotation invariant. So essentially, we want this to be measured as the same as that, even though they are parameterized differently. For surfaces, it's similar to curves, except that instead of taking points from a 1D space, we're taking points from a 2D space and mapping them over to 3D. And similarly to curves, I've provided one of the more basic examples, which is just mapping points from this to this with spherical coordinates. But if I were to change Q, then it might be a different shape over here. Just like with curves, we're forced to discretize surfaces, and measure and analyze them. So for curves, the discretized version was just a set of points. For surfaces, the discretized version is a mesh, which is a set of points along with faces that connect those points. And just like with curves, the choice of sampling points has no physical meaning or significance. It's arbitrary. And we want two objects with different parameterization, but the same shape, to be measured the same. So here, there are fewer vertices, and also the face connection between the vertices is different than over there. So that's a different parameterization, but we want it to be measured as the same shape. In comes the space of curves and the space of surfaces, which solves this problem for us. In the space of curves, every point on the space of curves represents a different curve shape, and similarly for the space of surfaces. And one of the key aspects of that is the Riemannian metric that we choose to equip these spaces with. So earlier I showed you the sphere example of a metric, which was pretty nice. It was just like a nice matrix that was diagonal and pretty simple terms. In the case of curves and surfaces, the metrics are very complicated, way more complicated than for landmarks as well. A few things, if you take anything out of this slide and you want to use Geomstats to analyze curves and surfaces, the things that I want you to take away are these pink underlined parameters. You have a choice in what you choose to put them as. For example, A will penalize bending, B will penalize stretching. So if the ratio between A and B is high, then two curves that are very stretched with respect to each other will be far apart on the manifold. So distances will be large. If the ratio between A and B is low, then those will be closer together. There's a less clean explanation for these parameters, for surface parameters, but essentially what you need to know is that by changing these parameters, you change the way that distances are defined. So A0 penalizes how much the vertices are moved around. A1 penalizes stretching, A2 penalizes non-smoothness, B1 penalizes shearing, C1 penalizes changes in normals, and D1 is everything else, i.e. like how a triangle moves about a normal vector, stuff like that. Can you imagine doing all of these computations by hand? I can't, and I never have, and I never will, because of this wonderful package called Geomstats, which Nina, me, and our lab develops. Apparently 154,000 people agree with us that it's much better to use Geomstats than do any of these things by hand. And these are some of the papers that have come out of it in our lab. So Geomstats makes your life so much easier if you're trying to tackle any of these problems, because you can essentially boil any statistical computation down to 2 steps, which I'll get to in a second. But first, we'll do an example of calculating the mean point in Kendall shape space. Why would someone do this? One example is to learn the mean landmark set of a set of dogs. Like you can do this if you have 5 dogs, 10 dogs, 2 dogs, whatever. I'm sure that you can all think of examples in your own research, but in medicine, the mean landmark set can be used as a template for patient anatomy. Okay, so the two steps are first you instantiate the shape space. So choose the shape space, which in this case is our pre-shape space, which is what I was talking about, how this space is only invariant to translation and scaling. If we wanted to do the full Kendall shape space, then we would do the full Kendall shape space. But this is just an example. So first you instantiate the space. Space equals pre-shape space. Put in faces. And then you have to define the metric, because I've been trying to emphasize that the metric is very important. You cannot compute distances without the metric. So anytime you're computing statistics, you have to define a shape space object and you have to define a metric, and then you can do your learning. So in this case, we're computing the mean. It's quite easy. Geomstats has made it easy for us. We just have to import Frechet mean, estimator equals Frechet mean, put in the space, because the Frechet mean will vary depending on the space and the metric, and then fit the points. Yeah. Geomstats is pretty nice. Yeah.
What kind of data do you have to give it? Does it have to be like photos or PNGs, or can you
So,
feed it into files?
It needs to be an array, like an array of points. That's a really good question. You have to do all of the pre-processing beforehand. It takes tensors. Yeah. And if you have an array and you try to feed it to Geomstats, then it'll throw you an error. So you have to say array equals gs.array, unless it's already a tensor. That's a really good question. That was very important. Yeah. Okay, another example, computing a geodesic between points on the space of discrete curves. Why would someone do this? Well, the geodesic minimizes an energy function on the manifold. So, and it also realizes the shortest path between 2 points. So someone might want to do this to estimate the path of least energy / resistance trajectory between 2 cells, purely from a shape deformation perspective. Yeah. And then similarly, we instantiate the shape space and run estimation for learning. So we import the manifold, which is discrete curves, the metric, which is the elastic metric. We also have to import the ambient space, which is R2 in this case. And then recall these really important parameters that I was talking about earlier, A and B. Your choice of parameters will affect distance. So you define the manifold, the metric, and then you can do your statistics. And in this case, again, Geomstats makes it really easy. All you have to do is geodesic equals metric dot geodesic, initial curve equals start cell, end curve equals end cell. Again, start cell and end cell have to be an array of points. And then if you want to compute points along that geodesic, then you can give it an array of x's. And this is a result, this is real data, and this is an actual result of a geodesic between 2 cells. And you can kind of see that it's a very nice, smooth deformation between 2 cells. More complicated example, and I just had to add this because this actually is very relevant to my research, is geodesic regression on discrete curves. So the idea behind geodesic regression on brain shapes, for example, let's say you have an array of brains that you're measuring through time, like MRI images. You pre-process them so that then you have a mesh for each brain shape. Then we already talked about this, but we have the space of brains where each point on the space of brain corresponds to a different brain shape. And the question becomes, or before that, now that we have the manifold, the meshes, Now all of these brains in the series of brains, instead of being a series of MRI images that we have to compare, they're now each points on manifold. So now we can apply statistics to it to characterize it. So how can we characterize brain shapes changing over time? How can we characterize cell shapes changing over time as they get cancer? How can we, I don't know, anything that has a shape, you can characterize it changing. It's amazing. That's why I love geodesic regression. That's why I had to tell you guys about it today. So what
Just to ask
exactly?
his question
Yeah, yeah.
again, maybe the step 2 here is not done in Geomstats. You have to do
Correct.
that before you load the data in.
Yes,
What you're loading is discrete point positions. That's the
Yes.
array that you mentioned, and you have to
Yes.
tensorize it or whatever.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
We have to have discrete point positions. And
Exactly.
That's a pre, okay.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, and you also have to have an array. And I'll get to this in the code part, but you also have to have an array that specifies like the point face relations. So like each one of these vertices has like a number, and then you have to have an array of faces. Let's say this is 1, 2, 3. This is a poorly drawn picture. Imagine this is a complete triangle. 1, 2, 3. Then you have to have an array of faces for every single face that is like, this face is called 1, 2, 3. Yeah. So that they have the same parameterization, so that each of the faces corresponds to the same set of vertices.
And maybe just a stupid computational question. Obviously, if you make finer and finer discretization, programs are going to run slower and slower.
Oh my gosh, yeah, that's been my last 2 papers, actually,
Okay.
is because I've tried to run Geomstats on brain shapes, and it's extremely slow. And I've been coming up with new forms of geodesic regression to make it actually usable on meshes with high.
It is an
realism.
ongoing challenge.
It's an ongoing challenge.
Yeah.
And I can actually mention, I'm so happy you asked about that.
Okay.
And I can mention the ways that we've been trying to make it faster in the next slide. So what is geodesic regression? A common form of statistical analysis is linear regression, which minimizes the distance between a linear model and data points. So you can see that linear regression tries to fit a line and learn that line by minimizing the linear distance between the data points and that line. This was developed in 1805. It's very not new, very old news. Geodesic regression, on the other hand, was developed in 2011. So we're about 206, or exactly 206 years late. And that's why this is a new thing and that it's very exciting that Geomstats implements it. Geodesic regression, on the other hand, minimizes the distance between a geodesic model and the data points. So instead of fitting data points with a line, we fit the data points with a geodesic, and we learn this geodesic by minimizing the geodesic distance. Going back to how we make this faster, my past 2 papers have been about how maybe we shouldn't actually be measuring the geodesic distance between the line and the geodesic. Maybe we should be measuring a linear distance, because what we found is that by measuring a linear distance, especially in the case of meshes, it actually makes the computation more accurate, and it's, I think, on the order of millions times faster. Do you remember the exact million?
Insane, yeah.
Millions.
Because, yeah,
Yeah.
for each data point,
Insane,
you.
Yeah. And then we calculated the maximum likelihood estimator of the model that we think is actually generating points, mesh points. And it actually is just the linear distance. So our little hack to speed things up is actually very good and very much the truth. Isn't that great when that happens?
I've never done that with this, but yeah. It's happened. The question about this that I don't understand right now is, what are you actually fitting in the geodesic regression? Are you actually changing the parameters in the metric? Are you finding the best a metric that gives the geodesic that best describes the set of data? Or are you just fixing the metric and fitting something else?
It's a great question. We fix the metric.
Okay,
And each geodesic is characterized by okay, going back a step. With a line, each line can be characterized by its y-intercept and its slope. Similarly, each geodesic can be characterized by a point and a tangent vector.
okay.
Yeah. Because if you have, let's say you have a point here, like on this right side, and you have a tangent vector here, then this is the unique geodesic that will be produced by this point and this tangent vector. So the point is kind of like a y-intercept, tangent vector is kind of like a slope. So when we're learning the geodesic, we're varying the point and the tangent vector.
Given the metric.
I have a question, actually.
Mhm.
Is there like maybe more than one tangent vector that's needed to characterize something that might loop around in a way that the persistence length almost of that tangent vector is kind of lost, because it might turn around and then that same tangent vector might not capture the full curvature of the geodesic reduction. I'm thinking about it as like noodle,
Like a what?
like a noodle. If I cook a noodle, it'll be
Mhm.
really floppy.
Mm-hmm.
And if I have one tangent that I've described at some point,
Mm-hmm.
but the noodle way away from here is actually bent towards me,
So are you,
then stepping farther and farther away means that that one tangent vector might not be as accurate. Because maybe the end of the noodle is curved.
so if the end of the noodle, so a geodesic is not just a segment. It's in a space of, I think it's like kind of dependent on the geometry or topology of your space. So for example, if you have a sphere, then each geodesic actually kind of like does loop back on itself. Because in the case of a sphere, are there pens?
Potentially that way. But I'm just thinking about this example that you've shown where
Right.
the orange noodle, I suppose,
Yes.
goes through a number of bends.
Mm-hmm.
And if I were standing on one end,
Mm-hmm.
I might see one tangent. Whereas if I'm halfway through, that tangent might.
The space is bent, Angela.
The space is
It's a
bent.
tangent in a bent space, right? That's why it's bent.
Exactly.
It's
That's
not,
Yes.
yeah,
Yeah, so this is a curved space.
he's like
Forgot about
doing
that.
general relativity here, basically,
forgot
yeah,
about that.
it's- yeah.
It is very trippy
Yeah.
when you haven't been thinking about this for
Yeah.
I have not been thinking.
many
about this.
years
that's-
like I
that's-
have. It's very, very trippy. This geodesic is the manifold generalization of a line. So in flat space, the shortest distance between 2 points is just a line. Or it isn't a line. The shortest distance between 2 points is realized by a line. In curved space, you're not allowed to take lines through that space because the points along the line don't fall in the manifold. So in curved space, the path that will realize the shortest distance will be a curvy path like this. So this on a manifold is the same idea as a line in Euclidean space.
I appreciate you taking time to explain that.
Oh my gosh, of course. I love talking about this. This is my research.
I'm gonna ask you another question then, if you're
Yeah.
so happy to talk.
I'm happy to talk.
I know you're talking about brains and cells, but brains and cells are too complicated in their physics for this question. So I'll tell you something that people in this room do, or at least my lab does, right?
Okay.
So we have pictures of gels, so little elastic things, three-dimensional things, and maybe we can perturb it and take a video as it relaxes back to some equilibrium according to the laws of sort of elastic physics, whatever governs the viscoelasticity of the gel, right? And so let's say I want to learn materials properties
I love
of
this.
the gel
Yeah,
from the trajectory of images.
okay,
Can you help me do this?
yeah. I mean, you can put little beads in the gel, which are
Sure.
essentially landmarks.
We do that sometimes,
Yeah.
yes.
And then each landmark set, that's great. You don't even have to worry about like.
I guess the
parameters.
question is really, I understand I could give you data that you could input into Geomstats.
Oh, yeah, okay.
But how do you get me physics out of it?
Oh,
And that's
that's a
maybe
great
the real
question.
question, right?
Okay.
Actually, a
Yeah,
real
yeah.
modulus or a spring constant in
great.
real newtons and meters and pascals,
So I
right?
think,
That's the part where I'm worried.
yes. So I know that I've heard that, for example, the elastic metric, the one with like A and B,
Sure.
has some connection that somebody derived to like physics. Do you remember what I'm talking about?
Yeah, the
Like a
egg
spring
with
constant.
stretching and
Yeah.
the bending of the river
Sure.
is actually connected to the
Yeah.
pockets here.
So for like a polymer, I could imagine that sort of got stretch
Yeah.
and bend elasticity,
Yeah.
and I know the materials constants.
Yeah.
So if I had a picture of a fluctuating noodle, Angela's hungry and is talking about noodles. There's a mapping there, someone's made a mapping. is what you're
Someone has
telling me.
made a mapping.
But maybe not for a three-dimensional object, like a
So
chunk of jello that's changing shape.
technically, curves are also defined in 3 dimensions. So you could, let's say, you have this like gel.
Yeah.
And then you've put little beads in the gel. You could define this curve. That's a discrete curve.
Sure.
And then you could take a video of these little things changing as you do whatever you do. And you could do, actually, this is another one of my papers that I have not talked about, but recall that the way you define A and B is directly related to distances on your manifold. So the way that you define A and B also defines what is a geodesic on your manifold. And we were running into this issue because we were creating synthetic geodesics between like circles or something, circles and ellipses. And one geodesic that was created with one set of A and B was not recognized as a geodesic by another set of A and B. So we made this project, we called it Elastic Metric Learning on the Shaped Space of Cell Curves. And essentially what we did is we learned the A and B that brought a series of shapes closest to a geodesic. In some way, defining like, which learns an A and B that are related
So
to.
now you're fitting, that's what I asked before, now you're
Yeah.
fitting the parameters.
Exactly. Now we're fitting the metric parameters.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
So now we're learning the A and B that brings this sequence
Yeah.
of curves closest to a geodesic. And I haven't worked out the exact math, but I know that there's that connection between A and B and the physics of it. But maybe that's a project.
Maybe we can train it too, if we know that.
Yeah, well, that's what
there's-
I'm curious, is that what we're saying now? We're
I'm
just gonna give
guessing.
it lots of examples where
You
we
could give it
know
an
the
ex-
modulus
yeah.
and then somehow we
Yeah.
find a.
With more
rubric for
homogeneous material,
connecting A
with
and
some
B to the
fiducial
modulus or
markings
something.
under some deformation.
Well, then that allows us to what, just look at the
Train it.
shape change to then back out the modulus, so we don't have to like actually have enough material that we would need for a reality.
Is it a better way to do rheology, seems to be, or a different way to do rheology, seems.
Especially with a small amount of material and some type of.
Maybe.
Which is scale invariant, so if you have a little bit, but you still have some fiducial markings and you impose the same stress, it should deform the same way as if you had a swimming pool size.
Sure. I mean, yeah, it's complicated for my chemistry brain, but
Me too. My mechanical engineering brain is kind of broken right now.
But it also seems as though, so if you have two different pathways that something could change shape, one would be a chemical pathway and one would be, let's say, a thermal pathway. They should impart different changes of strain on a material.
Okay.
So the shape changes differently
The
than the two
shape
pathways.
change
It
could be
changes
different between
differently.
the two pathways, which was something that we'd be very interested in decoupling between those two different pathways. If you could actually like feed it enough information where you could get out the chemical contribution versus, let's say, the thermal contribution.
How very appropriate for our
Right.
most recent manuscript.
Correct.
Where
Right,
there are two things that are happening.
I don't know. But I don't know how to,
Yeah, no, I
I
mean,
just don't know, I mean, we should, yeah, yeah.
well, it sounds like you're saying, you know, if you had like 100 data sets of 100 relaxations by, what was it, thermal for one of them?
Right.
And
Then you would
chemical.
find a metric for that, and then maybe
Look at it
they'd all be
and then you look at
geodesic,
it
but then you give it a
formally.
chemical one and it wouldn't follow geodesic because it's a different shape change. That's something like that. Does that sound, you guys know?
So what I'm actually
Better than me,
thinking
I'm just made it up. Yeah.
of, and this is maybe stretching my machine learning brain with the pathways or whatever, but if something follows one pathway versus another pathway, does it only follow one pathway or can it follow both at the
No,
same time?
Certainly can follow both at the
Then you
same
could
time.
maybe do some sort of a PCA,
Oh, no.
like PCA on
Sure.
shape space. And then that could give you the contribution of one pathway versus another. But geodesic regression is always useful too. Like if you know the, yeah. Wow, I'm so excited that you guys love this. Okay, now we get to geodesic regression in 2 simple steps.
And I should just say that for, it's about 4, a little past 4. If anybody has to go, I fully understand. I'm gonna be here.
This
So
is the
I'll keep-
last slide.
Oh, okay.
Yes,
Thank you so much.
we have incredible
We've been
time.
interrupting too.
But if anyone wants to go, feel free. So geodesic regression in 2 simple steps. Why would someone do this? We just went over a lot of reasons that someone would do this, but to characterize the evolution of a 3D mesh changing over time, and thus be able to compare different evolutions of different meshes. For example, in my research, I study the way that the female brain responds in response to sex hormones, like over the menstrual cycle or over pregnancy. In my case, can we learn the normal way to respond to these sex hormones? And if we see a brain responding a different way, that would have a different geodesic, we would learn a different geodesic as it's changing over time. And can we predict that that makes that person more likely to have like PCOS or some sort of illness? We can use it as a diagnostic tool, or you can use it for pathways or stuff like that. Again, stretching my brain now. Or you can use it to predict what the mesh will look like at a data point you don't have. So for example, let's say you have a measurement at time 1, 5, and 10. You could use geodesic regression to interpolate between those points or learn something at like time 100 or predict something at time 100. And again, 2 steps. First, instantiate the manifold. This is where you would put in the faces. And then when you compute distances, like if we were to do the Frechet mean, then like 0.1 would be the vertices. 0.2 would be the vertices of the second point. And these are the metric parameters that I was talking about in the earlier slide, where you have to choose them. Does Geomstats have like default?
Yeah. So if you just wanna put empty parentheses, we're gonna put a convenient default, yeah.
Then import geodesic regression, create geodesic regression object, have your array of X's, in my case, array of like hormone levels, in your case, maybe time. array of Ys, in my case, brain mesh, in your case, cube mesh, perhaps. And then gr dot fit. And then it'll give you an intercept and a coefficient, which it has learned from the regression fit. And this isn't a real result, but this is an example of what it would give you. So for example, the intercept hat, it would give you an array of points. It wouldn't give you the faces out because you've already defined what your faces are. And for the slope, it would give you an array of vectors which describe how each one of the which direction each one of the points is changing. In summary, we can define shapes and do statistics on shapes using the mathematical framework of landmarks, curves, and surfaces. These frameworks are conveniently and consistently implemented in Geomstats so that people can use them with limited knowledge of differential geometry. Thank you.
So I had a real nuts and bolts question. So
Yeah.
I know that you've had very successful collaborations with Denise Montel, who's a biologist who works with cells. And that's, I imagine, where some of the data that you saw came from today.
Actually, this one, I think, were from another collaborator at Colorado State University, but
Okay.
we also have Denise data somewhere, yeah.
What's cool is that you're working in very different fields, and what I'm wondering is how you started that collaboration. Did it require you to sit down with one of, let's say, Denise's students and say, here are the cells that I'm interested in, how do I get that data into your Geomstats? Or was it a matter of you sent data or they sent data to you? How did that kind of work? And how can we do the same?
So in Denise's case, it was that I think from my perspective, it was that they wanted to compute the mean shape of their cells. So they asked us for help.
Yeah. And I think some of the Denise's students Alison sent you the data
Yeah.
in the form of, did we have to segment? Yeah, we had to contour it.
I
So
think
they
it was
gave us
binary
binary
files.
images, yeah.
Yeah.
And we did the pre-processing of finding the points along the
It was
cells.
2D images, not.
Yeah.
2D images in that case, yeah. And then for the brains, they gave us also the segmentation, but we extracted the mesh. You
Yeah.
extracted the mesh.
Just to push further on
What's the
the
resolution that you guys need?
On each other.
I mean, because those images are pretty high resolution,
Which one?
right? If it's a 2D image off of a confocal microscope, but like a picture that I take of a gel and the fuzziness of the boundaries, I guess what I'm wondering is like, how much does that matter? Because what you guys are getting are relatively speaking much higher resolution images and.
There's still noise in, I'm sure,
Yeah,
what
there's
Denise
still
is giving
noise.
and what you're getting from the MRI, right? There's still gonna be noise and
Quite
whatnot.
a bit of noise, okay.
There's probably a question of what feature size you're hoping to see. That's,
I guess that's the
noise that's gonna
That's right, yeah.
get rid of some high intensity features. Yeah. What, can I just ask, just push on Angela's question, what do you learn? Like what biology came out of what the shape analysis of Denise's data? Like I can understand roughly based on already what you showed, what kinds of analyses you did, but how did it feed back to them? It's sort of my same question about what
Yeah.
physics can I get from the image analysis? What biology did they get or what did
Yeah.
they learn? Maybe they also wanted physics, I don't know.
In this case, they had 3 groups of cells and they wanted to know whether septin had some effect on border cells. So they had a group of control cells, a group of cells where septin was overexpressed, a group where it was knocked down, and we computed the mean shape of each cell and tried to show that, oh, mean shape is different.
So this
It was pretty
Fouché kind of
simple.
analysis that you were talking about, effectively, that was the tool in that case. This Fouché mean, that's what, yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
exactly,
okay.
exactly. Yeah.
Cool.
We could also report back maybe state of disease. If it's a very small cell compared to the rest, that might be one that's maybe stressed out or
Yeah.
about to die.
Yeah.
Well, maybe the
Some
harder
biology
question is going off of Javier's, there's a mean shape for 3 populations, but then there's error bars on that because there's
Oh.
error in the data. And so how do you compute significance of difference between different shapes? That's maybe, you approach that.
I don't.
Are two different shapes significantly different relative to the noise?
Yeah, you can build hypothesis testing in that
Yeah.
framework, like
Okay.
equality of means, but equality of mean shapes. So you can extract a p-value, yeah.
Yeah, maybe that question, here's Moya, maybe I can jump in and potentially if you fit some regression model, then you can potentially have a different noise value for each curve that as a like standard deviation or variance of that regression model that allow you to encode that noise. That's what I feel.
Thank you.
Thanks.
It's cool.
Yeah.
I had to think about how to. Yeah, I agree with you, Angela. Like, how do you start?
It's always the first.
It is the first question when we're so, like, it's so, in a sense, so far away, but we're probably not that far away.
Binarized images are good.
I mean, yeah.
Thresholding.
But yeah, thresholding, not having a
Yep.
intensity value, but integer value. Even if you have like 9 different integers that denote 9 different things in the image, then that you can segment, or just 0 and 1s.
Yeah, or if you just have beads in a gel and you, let's say you have 0 tools to pre-process that data, literally just like putting an origin in that frame and hand recording like the XY or XYZ coordinates of each of those beads, because that is something that you can put into Geomstats.
Something that our group is doing too is that we're deforming manually by using instruments samples. So we're imposing some kind of a shape change that is generally well characterized using some physics models, including Hertzian contact mechanics and other types of contact mechanics models. But I think it'd be really cool to see if we could maybe predict some shape changes in a sample that has a different elastic modulus or a different stiffness.
Totally.
Using these almost virtual, I guess, digital twins, I suppose, of your whole sample.
Yeah, like if you deform the object using the same tool, same force, can you predict the shape change that will result? And that kind of relates back to your question of what physics can we get out of it? And it kind of relates back to the fact that I would suggest using the curve model where you have those A and B parameters that are linked by someone else, not me, back to some physical quantity, and maybe you could learn something from that.
Yeah, especially since we're dealing with some pretty complicated types of materials, especially ones that have different types of structures at the surface versus in the bulk.
Totally.
And so having some kind of a virtual model that we could impose controlled stresses or controlled shape changes would be pretty valuable. But again, I don't know how best to start. But we've got lots of ideas of what we'd love to learn. What would you like to learn?
Yeah, I'm gonna have to look.
Yeah, we can have more discussions
Thank you so
too.
much, that was really great.
It would be fun for you guys to come to some of ours too, and then see some of the things, and then maybe this will be the starting place, so that
Some
we can see
pictures, yeah.
some pictures of things, and be like, well,
Shapes.
you guys are like,
We've got shapes.
yeah, we got lots of shapes and pictures. It might be nice to then better understand, like, are we in the right ballpark of how we are collecting those
I
types
like
of
the
pictures,
on the
right?
left.
But what's
Right.
that?
So I don't know when the next talk is, if we have such
We
a,
have to
such a
make
presentation,
plans.
right?
Yes, I think that'd be
So
good.
then we can join you guys, that'd be good.
That's good.
And thank you so much.
Of course, thanks for the great
Cheers.
questions.
All right, if there are any questions from Zoom, feel free to email them now. If not, thank you so much, everybody, and feel free to email Miolane's group or Adele directly. I'm sure that they are open to any questions that you might have.
Definitely.
If not, thank you so much, and happy summer.
Thank you, Angela.
Thank you.
So much for organizing.
Of course. All right, I'm gonna end the chat now. Take care, everybody.
Good evening.
Bye.
Bye.